Yes, as Ross says, I'm here to talk to you tonight about climate change and archaeology in Scotland. And basically what I want to do is give you a kind of overview of the kind of things that we are increasingly having to think about in the heritage sector, you know, the effects and the impacts of climate change and how we might respond to them. So just in terms of an overview of my talk here, really just this is in some senses a personal experience of the dealing with the effects of climate change, and I just wanted to get across to you how we're thinking about it as heritage professionals and how we're working across the sector to deal with the kind of impacts that everyone is very familiar with these days. So this will be a kind of relatively informal overview, and I should probably say at this stage that while I may refer to sort of studies, policies and strategies of other organisations, it's not impossible that I'll stray into the realms of personal opinion here. So while I'm not proposing to say anything that I think is too controversial, it's probably important just to flag up that this talk is definitely coming from the point of view of my personal opinion. So I wouldn't want anyone to be saddled with that other than me. So we'll cover a little bit about what's at risk, what kind of archaeology is at risk of the effects of climate change. We'll think about what could be lost and how we'll know when we've lost it. How do we quantify and establish what it is that's at risk? And then finally, have a bit of a think about how we could respond as a sector and how we should respond. And that may be the section where I'm a little bit erring on the side of personal opinion, but these are things that we need to discuss as a heritage sector and as people with an interest in archaeology and history in general. So in terms of introducing climate change, I don't think I need to do too much of that. This is a topic that everyone will be very familiar with. Those of you who are subscribers to Historic Scotland's magazine will have seen the latest edition, where Taking Action is their headline, and there's this extensive article about how they're tackling climate change and its effects across the properties and care. A little bit more about which later. But in general, I don't think I need to say too much about what climate change is. We all have heard the headlines, we've all seen the graphs, the trajectories that we're on. But really, it's a bigger topic than just archaeology. But what I want to bring our attention back to is how we deal with these things in every aspect of our lives, and you know, taking care of the things that we as a society consider valuable. And that, in that respect, history and archaeology come right to the fore. This is all, of course, very relevant because of the forthcoming COP26 conference. So, as everyone is probably aware, these topics will be debated on an international stage in Glasgow. And so this is all stuff that, you know, as a planet, as a sort of international community, we need to be thinking about and talking about and addressing the things that we value most. I do need to start with some statistics, though. It's probably important to do that. And yet again, I won't be labouring the point, but just to remind everyone that that 2020 was the third warmest year on record, the fifth wettest, the eighth sunniest, and multiple other records have been broken over the past decade. So there's really no need to kind of emphasize to people the trajectory that we're on. Anyone who takes the time to familiarize themselves with climate science and the climate reports that are being produced annually will be more than aware of the situation that we're in. But what this means for archaeology is that you know, we're seeing increasingly extreme weather events. Excuse me. These are increasing in intensity and in frequency, and the energy levels of the kind of events that we're talking about, storms, flooding events, coastal erosion, all of this is increasing in intensity and in energy level, and that necessarily means that the effect on the historic environment is greater. So as I'm talking tonight, just think about it in those terms, that all of the things that cause change in the historic environment are happening faster and more intensely than ever before. Again, without labouring the point, there's been many studies and many visualizations published recently. Last year, Climate Central published their model of sea level change projections, and this is just quite an effective way of getting across the kind of impacts that we're looking at seeing in the coming decades. So their model projects that within 100 years, so with say by 2050 certainly, we're going to see sea level rise of up to 1 meter in places. And so if you browse the web map on the Climate Central website, you can see this data visualized and the areas of the coast where it will be most have most effect. And it doesn't take an awful lot of work to establish that this is going to have a very dramatic impact on lots of archaeological sites, not just along the coast, but other sites integrated into the whole water system connected with the coast. So these are fairly sort of alarming visualizations and alarming figures, but just to emphasize that these are the kind of trajectories that we're on. Thinking then in terms of what's at risk, and this is something that takes a little bit more thought than necessarily is immediately obvious. And I just wanted to kind of make the point that all archaeological sites are preserved for a reason. Either they've escaped mechanical damage, by which I mean like physical damage, like ploughing, quarrying, or reuse. They've not been robbed or built on top of, or they've become buried and protected through a process of site formation that archaeologists call taphonomy. So this is the process of sites being buried and stabilized in the archaeological record. So the point I want to make here is that any changes to the balance that any archaeological site exists in inevitably result in loss of information. So decay is a kind of an inevitability for archaeological remains. All human activity that leaves a mark in the landscape or on the landscape inevitably decays over time, and all that matters is the balance between the rate of that decay and the factors that are preserving that site. It kind of stands to reason that our best preserved archaeological sites are our most fragile for that reason. So it's all about this balance, this sort of stasis in archaeological preservation. And sort of it stands to reason that any change to this taphonomic balance can only be neutral for an archaeological site at its very best. And in almost all cases, it's negative. So bottom line, climate change tends to be bad for archaeology. Now, there are sort of obvious ways that this has an effect. The most obvious is around the coast, and coastal erosion is clearly one of the areas where attention is most focused in terms of the impacts of climate change. And this can be mechanical in the sense that wave action, increasing sea level, has a much greater impact on archaeological sites. And this is the kind of thing that we can monitor over time. It's very, in sort of metric terms, it's quite straightforward to demonstrate that happening. And this is just an example that I quite like to draw people's attention to. This is the Broch site of Nibster in Caithness, up in the far northeast. This is a survey of the site that was made around about 1900 by John Nicholson when it was being first excavated. And if we just overlay that with a modern survey that my colleagues and I at AOC did there in 2011, we can see that along the north edge of the promontory, several of the buildings that Nicholson marks on his survey are now bisected by the cliff, and we've lost significant elements of those structures. And this is not by any means a unique case, but just an interesting example of how within the space of a century we can demonstrate that whole buildings are being lost to the sea, and just quite an apt illustration of the direct impact of coastal erosion. But again, going back to this point of what preserves archaeology for us and what allows us to study it, this is one of the key considerations when we think about what's at risk when we're looking at climate change. And for that reason, the nature of the preservation is important. Now, this slide I've put up here is a wetland site that my colleagues and I at AOC have been working on down in Wigtonshire, down in the far southwest in Priest and Galloway. It's a crannog-like structure. It's a wetland settlement built in a marshy location. Really exceptional preservation circumstances. So basically, because of the water logging there, you know, the whole site has remained largely wet since it was abandoned in prehistory. So this settlement, which was built around about the turn of the 5th, 4th century BC, is extremely well preserved, and so there's things that we can do with this kind of archaeology that isn't possible elsewhere. So we've been able to do things like extract information about where animals were on the site, for example. The level of preservation in plant remains and insect remains is giving us sort of details about activities happening in individual structures that it's really very difficult to extract from your average archaeological site. And because of the organic preservation there, we're able to, you know, to really refine our what we're able to say about the site to a very sort of fine resolution. So this slide that I've put up here is just a kind of illustration of why the preservation circumstances are very important, and it's all about this balance of so many factors in the soil. So pH, like, you know, levels of free oxygen in the water content and that kind of thing. All of these contribute to the sort of unique preservation circumstances of that site. And this section that I've put up here is a slot through one of the roundhouses built on this settlement. And just to illustrate my point, if you look up near the top of the section, let me just see if I can put on a pointer here. Okay. So up around the top of the section, you see this upper topsoil layer is full of archaeology, but it's almost entirely lost. You know, it's almost completely decayed away. There's very little we can say about that that level, other than that, you know, there was activity happening within a couple of centuries BC. That's about the level of resolution that we're able to extract from deposits like that. But as we've progressed down through the deposits, we can see they're increasingly well preserved until we get down to the very lowest levels, where we have timbers that preserve cut marks on them. We have wood chips that relate to a single event in, you know, in the woodworking on that site. And this is all directly relatable to the preservation levels there. So it just kind of neatly illustrates the resolution of information that we're able to extract from an archaeological excavation, and how that's directly related to you know, the stability of the preservation circumstances. So in terms of having made that point, in terms of what heritage and where the heritage is at risk, we can think about all of these factors as being sort of intertwined. So as I've said, coastal and intertidal zones are self-evidently at risk for obvious reasons. If waves are crashing up against a dry stone structure, for example, you can expect that dry stone structure to be badly damaged or compromised. And the same can be said of river terraces and floodplains, where increasingly severe flooding events will mechanically erode and damage those deposits. You know, will wash things away, will disturb the relationships between structures and their associated deposits. But slopes in general, fragile soils are a risk as extreme weather causes subsidence, but also in things like wetland and freshwater environments, like the ones I've just been describing down at Black Loch. There are much more indirect consequences of climate change. Well, obviously, water levels dropping in warmer summers means that otherwise waterlogged sites may be at risk of rotting away. It's always the waterlogging that preserves these wetland sites. So through desiccation, we're at risk of losing archaeological layers, but also more indirectly through things like increased nutrient levels. So as the productivity of freshwater bodies increases through this process called eutrophication, where nutrient levels increase through warmer water temperatures, this is generally bad news for archaeological organic preservation. And I guess the point that I'm making on this slide is that all of these things are kind of interlinked. It doesn't take much imagination to see how changes to flood patterns will affect soil stability, which in turn affects waterlogging and the soil chemistry that keeps all of these sites in their current preservation circumstances. Fortunately, we're living in a period where it's it's increasingly easy to pull data sets together about this, the information that we need to kind of map this risk and susceptibility to damage. And soil erosion is one that it's important to emphasize. So well, you know, again, I just wanted to make the point in contrast to coastal erosion, where mechanical damage is obviously going to impact on coastal structures. Soil erosion risk is something that is equally important in terms of the impacts of climate change. So mapping areas out in terms of their susceptibility for soils to be washed away or for their soil chemistry to be dramatically altered and changed is an important consideration when looking at, you know, the impact of the new types of weather and climate that we're going to see over the coming decades. So this is data compiled by the Hutton Institute, Soil Science Institute, and just working with that alongside our historic environment records, our national historic environment records, often known by the website name Canmore. You can see that it doesn't take an awful lot of work to suddenly start pulling out you know, these yellow dots are known archaeological sites, known find spots. And when you do that very quickly, you can see that large numbers of sites are in areas of soil erosion risk or within, you know, proximity to areas where soil erosion could have a consequence for the preservation circumstances. So all of this is just to kind of make the point that, you know, our archaeological sites don't exist in isolation. They're part of an environment that needs to be preserved for their preservation circumstances to remain static. I put this example up as a local illustration of how this can affect even inland areas. So I'm sure many of you were sitting at home thinking, yes, we don't have a coast in Callander, so that's not going to affect us, but that's clearly not the case. Although you don't have a coast, climate change is going to be equally an issue for everywhere in the country, everywhere on the planet indeed. But this example just shows how the risk of flooding through increased extreme weather can have a direct impact on our archaeological sites. So this is Callander right in the center of this slide here, and you can see this model from SEPA's flood risk model shows there are significant areas around the river where archaeological sites, which I can overlay on this slide. So these red dots this time are sites from the Canmore database, many of which are found in these high-risk flooding areas. And in case we're blasé enough to think that there may not be anything too important in these areas, you know, you have your Roman fort and the Little Lenny medieval chapel are just one of a number of very important sites that, you know, potentially at risk of quite significant damage through flooding in the coming decades. Okay, so all of that outlines the kind of things that can happen, the risks that we're looking at over the years. So what are we doing about it, and what are the things that we could do in terms of strategy going forward? So the 2009 Climate Change Act in Scotland has placed an obligation on all public bodies to setting targets for sustainability for things like the reduction of emissions and other practical measures, but also stimulated them to carry out risk assessments in terms of what archaeology, what heritage, what elements of the built environment are at risk of these vectors that we've been talking about so far. And most heritage organisations across the world, including all of the ones in the UK and Ireland, have carried out their own studies of the likely effects of climate change on the historic environment. Historic Environment Scotland is no exception, and you can download their climate change risk assessment from their website. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but just to illustrate some of the findings of their risk assessment, it's fairly eye-opening that, but nonetheless a good illustration of the scale of the problem. So their risk assessment deemed that somewhere in the region of 90% of their properties, so 313 out of their 352 properties in care, were deemed to be at an unacceptable risk of the effects of climate change. So that's pretty much all of them. And even if you take into account some of the the mitigation measures that have been put in place in some of these sites, there's still well over half of the properties in care in Scotland are at a very high risk of negative effects from climate change vectors. So that kind of just illustrates, that's Historic Environments Scotland's study of their own 300 odd properties in care. But when we compare that to the fact that there's well over 300,000 sites and monuments in our national database, in the national record, you can see the scale of the problem. So not all of these are of equal importance, but all of these are an element of the historic environment. So, if we were to consider that 90% of that 300,000 sites were at some sort of risk of climate change, then you can see the scale of the problem that we have on our hands. I just wanted, in terms of of carrying out some proactive studies, I just wanted to give an illustration of some work that we've been doing recently with the National Trust for Scotland and with Dan Rhodes from the archaeology team there. And that's been taking a step forward in analysing all of the available data sets that we could get our hands on to take this proactive step towards quantifying the scale of the issue and guiding us towards something like a strategy for dealing with some of the major effects. So the National Trust for Scotland, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the organisation, but has properties all over the country. You may think about their historic buildings first and foremost, but the Trust looks after large areas of natural heritage as well, containing lots of archaeology that's been documented but not necessarily investigated. So we were working with Dan and the archaeology team at the NTS to come up with a way of quantifying the level of risk to the archaeology and historic sites on NTS properties. So the way we were doing this is again just to make the most of the availability of these excellent data sets that we're able to get our hands on these days. Foremost of which is probably the National Coastal Change Assessment. And again, I would recommend going and looking at the data for yourselves. It's all presented very nicely on the Dynamic Coast website. But it's all available for download to allow us to work with in studies like these. And the way that this study has gone about quantifying the changes that we're likely to see is by using reliable cartography, basically Ordnance Survey mapping through the Ordnance Survey era, to plot the position of the mean high water springs mark across the coast of Scotland. And in doing that, we're able to plot out, or the collators of the study have been able to plot out the areas where the most dynamic changes are happening along our coasts. All of this is a very sort of broad brush approach. Obviously any data set is caveated by the fact that local topography and local circumstances may change some of the impacts here, but nonetheless, this is one of the best and most reliable models of the trajectory of coastal change in Scotland. And this is a kind of key element of the study that we used when we were looking at NTS's properties. So we carried out a number of studies using different data sets, some of which I've already described. And we looked at areas in proximity to eroding coastline. We looked at land susceptible to soil erosion, where that may be an issue. We looked at topography, so particularly steep slopes and where these are found next to coasts and rivers, for example. We used historical data relating to the historic environment as well. So areas that have been mapped as relict. So that's to say, areas where we know there have been past activities preserved in the landscape as it survives today. So using something called the Historic Land Use Assessment, which you can get from Historic Environment Scotland's website, we're able to map these areas of preserved relic land in relation to coasts, rivers, lochs, and so on. And by definition, these areas are areas that are much more sensitive to change and potential loss in terms of damage to heritage. So we looked at areas of flood risk susceptibility and also areas susceptible to landslide and that kind of thing. So pulling all of these data sets together to help us quantify where all of these vectors kind of intersect and pinpoint areas that might warrant further work or at least closer monitoring in future. So this is just a nice little example. This is one of NTS's properties in Unst and Shetland. And this map, what you can see here, the red boundary is mapping the extents of the National Trust land. The red polygons are these areas of relict land that I was talking about. So these are areas that have been mapped as being, well-preserved areas of past activity. The blue polygons you can see there around the coast are buffers surrounding the national coastal change data sets, identified areas where the coast is dynamic and erosion is known to be happening. So as you can see, just sort of intersecting all of these data sets, and then by overlaying information from the Canmore database, we can see that in certain situations where we have, relict land, dynamic coast known to be eroding, and then in close proximity, the find spot of earlier medieval objects, in this case, some Norse objects, right on the beachfront, right on this actively eroding coastline. We can see that immediately we know we must have a fairly sensitive parcel of land in heritage terms there. So these kind of bigger picture data sets all converging to give us these sort of pinpoints of areas that we can point to and say, okay, well, maybe we should think about at least doing more survey work to understand better what's in these areas. Another example from another NTS property, this is at Balmacara. And again, just to give an illustration of some of the scale of these impacts, again, these intersecting areas of relict land, eroding coastlines, steep topography, that kind of thing, and then overlaying with the Canmore database illustrates here that this quite extensive area of probably medieval and post-medieval farming activity preserved along the coast, a very typical sort of northwestern archaeological landscape, a quite obvious risk of impact from coastal erosion and from the effects of climate change. In other areas, it's not quite so straightforward. This is Pabbay on the Outer Hebrides. And again, you can see there's an area of eroding coastline marked here. But you can see that the coastline is dynamic. And in some places, it's eroding fast. In other places, it's actually accreting sediments. So, an area that's, seeing lots of change in the coastal environment. And again, just by overlaying historic environment data, we can see that there are several potentially quite sensitive archaeological sites there. In this case, the human remains turning up in association with probably a prehistoric midden. So very likely archaeological activity in the immediate vicinity of somewhere that we know to be at risk of these vectors of climate change. So this is just a kind of a very brief overview of the work that we've been doing with the National Trust to help them get a handle on some of the areas that might be considered at risk, and take a sort of proactive approach to the quantification of that problem. So, already just with this first study that we've done with them, we're looking at somewhere in the region of 190, 200 archaeological sites or historic buildings that could warrant further attention. So these are some of the ways that we can kind of quantify the issue, quantify the things that we're facing, but how do we respond? And that's something that the heritage sector across the country needs to think about collectively. And we're lucky in Scotland in that we have several organisations and guidance documents to address this kind of thing. So a good place to start is the Our Place in Time document produced by the Scottish Government, which sets out a vision for how Scotland as a country wants to deal with and engage with its historic environment. And without going through the contents of that policy document, and the important thing to pull out here was the sort of key three key elements of understand, protect, and value, or share and celebrate. And so all of these kind of elements of how we approach our historic environment should have equal weight in the way that we respond. We need to understand and investigate our sites. We need to know what they are. We need to look after them. We need to come up with strategies for caring for them. But we also need to value them. We need to make sure that the cultural value that we get from these sites and monuments finds its way through to the public at large. So in terms of a strategy for dealing with this kind of thing, this really emphasizes the importance of quantification. And this is what I just want to talk about in the last part of my talk. And that's the sense that this modeling and predictive element of studying climate change effects doesn't really help us in the production of a strategy at all, in the senses of how to deal with sites that we know to be at risk. It can identify areas of sensitivity, environments, locations, and things that warrant closer monitoring and investigation than others. But establishing the extents of sites is essential, and we need to know where our heritage preservation starts and ends, and what the extent of that preservation is. These are all things that we need to know before we can fully appreciate and address the sensitivity of any individual site. So the other thing to emphasize is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution here, and areas of activity, that around archaeological sites or monuments that might be peripheral or of negligible importance in one situation might be essential elements of and keys to understanding others. So there's not going to be one solution that fits everything here. So all we can do is offer some appropriate strategies in response to the quantification of the problem. So just to give a few sort of a very brief overview of a few examples that I personally have been involved in, and lots of other heritage organisations and colleagues of mine have been doing very similar projects. But this is an example from the Outer Hebrides again. This is Vulan on South Uist, very well known archaeological site to archaeologists. It's a broch, it's one of these monumental dry stone towers built in the Iron Age in Scotland. And when after the excavations that were conducted there by Sheffield and Cardiff universities in the 1990s, there was this seawall built in front of it to protect the site. So this is the beach here, this is the coastline, this is the broch here, and this concrete seawall that was put in front of the broch to do something to help protect the monument from the impacts of mechanical coastal erosion. But it was found that when the site was visited in 2018, the seawall is actually in relatively poor condition. It hadn't fared too well against the battering of the Atlantic that site gets. So we were asked at AOC to go and do some work at that site. So the first thing we did was this high-resolution three-dimensional survey, this topographic survey that carried out using laser scanning to produce a very high-resolution terrain model of the site. And that's always a good place to start when you're looking at monitoring and quantifying the problem. So this sort of high-res model allows us to have a baseline record of the site that we'll be able to compare future changes in condition to. But because areas of this site were damaged, we also carried out some excavations around the damaged parts of the seawall. We were able to take new samples relating to archaeological deposits that had been important in the 1990s excavations, and before any of these were compromised through any of these erosion factors that we've been discussing. And we were able to then instate some of these steel cage gabions filled with these big beach cobbles. And again, just a temporary measure, nothing that's going to protect this site from the long term, but going some way to dispersing the wave action as it crashes against this important archaeological site. But Vulan is quite a good illustration of the complexity of the problem that we face. This is just a satellite map, a Google map of South Uist from above. So you can see the position of Vulan right on the west coast of South Uist here. It sticks out into the Atlantic. There's literally nothing to protect it at all. This square here highlights where the site's located. And this neck of land, which is effectively beach cobbles and sand, is where this broch is built. And so there's really no solution to this to the problem that this site faces. It gets battered by the Atlantic, there's nothing to protect it, and it will be lost at some point, and that's just the reality of the situation. So as a kind of archaeologists and as heritage managers, we need to think about what our response to that site will be, and that's something I'm going to leave deliberately open-ended. But turning to another example at Clachtoll Broch in Assynt, this is just an illustration, another site that I've been lucky enough to be involved with, working with the local community up in Assynt, and thanks to the funding from Historic Environment Scotland and National Lottery and other sources, they were able to do a major campaign of archaeological excavation and conservation at that site. So this is another one of these Iron Age brochs, these monumental dry stone towers, and you can see again it sits in this typical coastal location. This is the waterfront here. And in this particular site's case, you can see that on the south wall, there had developed this nasty looking hole underneath one of the best preserved parts of the site. And there was an awful lot of concern that if that hole, which was constantly being eroded by waves crashing over the site, if that became unstable enough, that the whole thing would collapse, losing all the structural integrity of the dry stone tower, but also dramatically compromising the internal deposits, effectively meaning that, you know, the heritage value of that site was completely reduced. So we were able to, with the funding that the project managed to secure, we were able to carry out quite a major conservation program there, stabilizing the structure as far as possible. In this case, we largely down-took most of the south wall and replaced it with more stable foundations with concrete plinths to hold things in position, so that a collapse is far less likely to happen. And this image is just showing you a laser scan of the wall before and after consolidation. So you can see that the stones were put back almost exactly in their original positions. But perhaps more important than that was the project that went alongside that conservation work, which was the excavation of the internal deposits and the creation of this site that's now secure, much more stable, by no means protected indefinitely against the effects of coastal erosion, but much more stable and much more visitable, safe and accessible for the public. And this project that involved hundreds of people, both remotely, both directly in terms of the excavation, and also indirectly through learning initiatives alongside it, meant that the value, the heritage value of this project was quite immense. And I'd direct you to the Clachtoll Broch website to find out some more about that particular project. But again, a response that seems appropriate in the face of an inevitable fate for that site. Other projects that, again, I just want to briefly draw your attention to. Recently, we've been working with a community group based down in Whithorn on a project called Machars Waterborne, and that's making use of the availability of high-resolution LiDAR data, this 3D imaging of the landscape, which allows us to carry out surveys almost remotely from our desks and to contribute new information to the historic environment record. And so this was as part of the Coasts and Waters 2020 Year of Coasts and Waters. We carried out this collaborative community effort looking into the archaeology of the Machars and documenting as many of these new sites as we could find, and following that up with field visits, so particularly focusing on coastal sites and those that might be vulnerable. So doing things like geophysics over eroding forts. This is quite a good example at a place called Loch on the western coast of the Machars Peninsula. And you can see that geophysical survey has allowed us to identify the remains of this defensive ditch, probable remains of internal structures and things, and we were able to record the eroding section of that ditch and its internal deposits where they were being exposed to the elements. This ridge you can see in this three-dimensional model here is the raised beach on the west coast of the Machars, so a very actively eroding frontier against the Irish Sea. And the same community group has further aspirations to record its archaeology. This is at Chapel Finian, again on the west coast of the Machars, and they have plans to go out there and do three-dimensional recording, which we'll be doing with them in the next few weeks. Again, just to document this site in detail, partly as a way of baseline recording for future management purposes, and partly as an opportunity to get that information out to as wide an audience as possible so that people can learn from this site for the future. Now, I know that this is something that members of this group are involved in as well. I was very pleased to be alerted to your survey of Portnellan Island, Crannog in the Loch there, and this is just a really good example of the kind of thing that every group can do, every individual can do, is contributing information, records and survey information, just to document our historic environment as it becomes exposed and put at risk of the effects of climate change. So in this case, the Crannog is much more accessible and visible because of extremely low water levels. So it was a really good opportunity, and I'm really glad that that it was taken to document that site in 3D and contribute that information to the national record. There are other organisations, of course, dealing with this kind of thing routinely. The SCAPE Trust particularly has been leading the way in community efforts in addressing archaeology at risk on the coast. And further afield, there's a collaborative project between the Republic of Ireland and heritage organisations here in the UK called CHERISH, and they've been establishing really good methodologies for three-dimensional recording and collaborative documentation of sites at risk along the coastal zone. But effectively, the point I'm trying to make here is that more information that can be collaboratively collated allows us to document the sites at risk, provide baseline information that we can use to monitor impacts going forward, and you really contribute to addressing and quantifying the problem of climate change. So again, just before I wrap up, there's a couple more points I want to make. Is that I've talked a lot about this idea of quantifying the issue. We need survey, we need more records, we need to know more about our sites. So it's important to quantify the level of risk and the extent of the historic environment that's at risk of these climate change vectors. And this is stuff that it's easy to do, whether you're using high-tech equipment or whether you're taking a camera and going for a walk. This is just all about contributing new information about sites and their condition, and that's something that anyone can do and something that I would encourage everyone to do. Recording and quantifying the problem is something that we need. But the final point I want to make is that quantification and sort of documentation is all very well, but that's only one part of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to put together. And there's kind of a natural tendency, I feel, that in face of the scale of the problem that we're facing in terms of heritage and climate change, that we want to just record, we just want to make records and move on to the next site. We need to know more, we need to know more. But it's important to emphasize that understanding our archaeology and using the information that comes from it is how we extract and maximize the value of these things that are at risk. So it's essential that we explore and investigate our sites, and the information that comes from them needs to set the agendas for future strategy. And I always like to, the way I like to put it is that something that we don't understand has no significance or no significant heritage value. So we should ask ourselves always, what is it we're trying to protect here? If we don't understand it, if we don't know what it is, then it's of less cultural significance to us as a society than if we can understand it and its context. And this slide here I've just put up is a good example of that. This is the Swandrow site in Orkney, and not a project I've been involved in, but just one that I've admired from afar. But a site directly threatened by coastal change, by coastal erosion, and they've carried out this sort of cutting-edge research excavation at that site and used the information that's come from it to push the agenda about what we know about the archaeology in the Orkney Isles more generally. So again, a good model of how addressing the problem can help us focus our attention for future strategies and move forward as a sector. And I think that will probably do for now. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Graeme. That was a really excellent talk. Really fantastic to kind of get much more of that wider context, some of the tough reality that we're facing, but I think that's a message that we all need to hear. And this was going to be one of my questions, but I think you picked up on it perfectly about what can local communities do to kind of help with this problem and the your advice about getting everyone out to record, to survey, and kind of create a baseline record, I think is such valuable advice. So that's really great. So you kind of answered that question, which is good, which is really good. But to kick off the Q&A, and if anyone else has any questions, do just pop them in to the Q&A function at the bottom there, which is just the kind of speech bubbles. Feel free to ask a question and I will ask it on your behalf. But just to kind of kick us off, I suppose, to speak more on the kind of nature of the tough decisions that are maybe ahead, do you have a sense of how best we can kind of measure the importance of sites? And how do we do that? We've obviously got, you know, scheduled monuments which are of national significance, and they're kind of codified in that way. But there's obviously a lot of sites out with that too. So do you have any suggestions on how that can be done?
I think that's probably the most difficult aspect of all of this, is that comparing sites one against the other and putting them in terms of priority of what we should do and when we should do it. We're always going to be working up against budget constraints. That's just the reality of archaeology and heritage in general. But my preferred way to answer that question would be to go back to this issue of understanding and having a research agenda. You know, we need to ask ourselves what it is we're trying to protect here, and you know, that doesn't make it necessarily any easier to rank things in terms of importance, but it does shine a strong light on archaeologists putting things in terms of frameworks, in terms of research agendas. What do we need to know more about to enhance our knowledge? You know, personally, I think there are classes of site where, you know, there's only so many that we need to excavate, but that's not an easy thing to say across the board. And I think that, and the other consideration there is that there are regional research questions that that are applicable as well. So what applies in Assynt, for example, doesn't necessarily apply in Wigtonshire. So yeah, it's a difficult question, but to me, it's all about research questions. What is it we need to know more about? And that helps place some priorities on how we respond.
That's great, thanks. And in terms of priorities more widely, a lot of your examples there were focusing on coastal erosion and some of the Broch sites that are at particular risk there. Is that where maybe a priority could be drawn initially? Is coastal erosion the kind of chief priority right now, or is it not as easy as that?
It's never as easy as that, but I think you're right. I mean, the coastal erosion is such an obvious place to start because it's very clear what's happening. It's very easy to measure change and the extent of damage, you know, even on an annual scale. I think what's much more difficult is perhaps thinking about landscapes, for example. If let's take something different to any of the examples I've shown tonight, where say the uplands of the Scottish borders, for example, or Perthshire or Stirlingshire for that matter. In many of these places we have really quite fragile preserved landscapes of things like prehistoric agriculture, for example, medieval agriculture, and they're not things, they're not objects, but they're entities as a whole, have a cultural value and a meaning. And I think it's much more difficult to map the impact on those and the degradation of those over time. And I think that's something that we need to think very carefully about in the future, that we don't focus on waves crashing over brochs and miss what's happening in the background, you know.
That's great, thank you. We have a question from Marilyn here. So given I'm just going to read this all out. Given the recent news that archaeology as a university course is diminishing in popularity with fewer students on a year-by-year basis, how will the many sites be chosen for investigation, recording and preservation, and who will provide the money?
That's again a good question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I think you're right to raise the issue of university training, because I think that's one of the most important challenges that we've got ahead of us. If we cut back on our leading research institutions and their funding, then we can't expect to be well equipped in future to deal with the things that we know are coming. There's fewer and fewer archaeologists coming into the profession every year at a time when we need more and more of them. So these are big picture questions that need addressed, and you know, I encourage you to write to your MP and make your point. But those of us who are on this call, I assume, are all people with an interest, with a stake in the historic environment. But it goes wider than that. You know, it's something that we have as a responsibility to protect for everyone. And I think you're right to point to where the next generation of archaeologists are coming from. And it's something that we need to address as urgently as anything.
That's great. Thank you very much. I wonder if you would be able to explain a little bit more about how LiDAR works, because I know there's a lot of interest in that. My understanding is that, you know, it's a very powerful tool. Are there any limitations to it? For example, kind of heavily forested areas or anything like that? Yeah,
so LiDAR works, essentially it's a laser scanning technique. So it's an instrument which is mounted to an aircraft. The aircraft is flown in systematic lines up and down the landscape, and it's taking hundreds of thousands of measurements of the ground surface as it flies over the landscape. And what that allows you to do is to produce a really high resolution terrain model of the ground surface. Now that's obviously really useful for archaeology because it allows you to see all the lumps and bumps and earthworks where there's features that we would otherwise map manually by walking over them. So it's an incredibly powerful thing, really effective technique for mapping archaeology and quantifying what's there. It works on a line of sight basis. So if you have something like, let's say a forest canopy, if the leaves are sufficiently dense that the laser beam can't see through the gaps between those leaves, then you won't get a model of the ground surface. But you often see in demonstrations of LiDAR this ability to strip away vegetation and show you the ground underneath. And what's happening there is because there's so many measurements being taken on such a dense grid that some of the laser measurements are going through the gaps between leaves and branches and finding their way to the ground. So the answer is yes, it can do things like remove vegetation and tree cover and that kind of thing, but up to a point, you know, only if there's a way, if there is some visibility of the ground underneath. So yeah, for archaeology, in all sorts of applications, but you know, for mapping, for quantification, for monitoring, condition survey, you know, all of these things, it's, you know, it's a game changer for archaeologists. Yeah,
that's good to have such a powerful tool brought to bear. I want to ask this question, but I definitely don't want to diminish the importance and the kind of stress and urgency of the situation. But one of your examples early on was about crannogs and how well preserved they are under the water. Are there any, you know, possible examples in which kind of erosion could actually benefit certain archaeology, or is that just not the way to look at it?
That would be very rare. I caveated my statement that all change is bad for archaeology by saying that there are certain situations where exposed deposits or exposed organics could potentially be buried or inundated, you know, which might in certain circumstances slow down their rate of decay. That's unusual. Almost always anything that changes how an archaeological site has survived over the decades, centuries, millennia is a bad thing for it. So it's unlikely that the only sort of cynical caveat would be that as someone who's struggled to study crannogs all over Scotland, if the water levels are a bit lower, they'd certainly be easier to get to and work on. But that doesn't mean that that's good for the archaeology by any means.
Sure. And I think just one final question. You know, given the urgency of the situation and how many sites are at risk, how do you kind of personally feel about, you know, the response as it is, and kind of do you feel positive about the next, say, generation in terms of a response to the historic environment in this way?
I think with my earlier comments about the training of the next generation of archaeologists aside, you know, that's a major worry for all of us working in archaeology. I have sympathy for those who draw up budgets and set policy, because it's an immensely difficult thing to do. You know, for all the reasons I've hopefully explained, you know, it's difficult to set priorities, and it's a very complex system. We're talking about all the different elements that interact with each other to give us quite unpredictable results. On the whole, I'm glad we have the organisations we have in this country that that prioritise caring for the historic environment. It's not a given that a country will have a suitably funded heritage organisation that looks after archaeology. It's not a given that we'll have things like the Heritage Lottery Fund, for example, that puts money into funding these initiatives. So on the whole, I'm glad that we have them, and they do good work and they promote good work. There's always more to do though, and I would always argue for more budget, you know, more capacity. But as long as we continue to shout about it, then I think that, you know, we can feel like we're protecting as best we can.
That's excellent. I think that's a fitting note to end on. So thanks again, Graeme, so much for such a hugely interesting, intellectually stimulating talk. That's really brought a lot of really important points to bear on this topic, and added a lot to the Climate Fringe Week, I think, for Callander. So thanks again so much.